Welcome back, everyone, to episode 4 from the Cognitive Science Show of Transcendent Naturalism. And I'm here with my ongoing partner in all of the Cog Sci Show projects, Gregg Henriques. So welcome, Gregg. It's great to be with you here again.
Thank you, friend. It's good to be back.
So I'm going to recapitulate what sort of happened in the past as we've been building the argument. And we're going to try and wrap up it being just you and I today in the 4th episode, and then get to having other people come in and reflect. So the first, I laid an argument out for a structured ontology and conformity epistemology that gave us a strong transcendence within extended naturalism. And then in episode 2, you laid out very, very clearly and comprehensively what those levels are. You filled in the content for the structure, I think is a good way of putting it. Episode 3, we wrestled together about how can we get a rich and deep notion of sacredness and the sacred within a transcendent naturalism.
Yep.
And then we came to, I think, a good convergent place around that. And then I wanted to pick that up in terms of, yes, at the theoretical level, fine, but how does that cash out in these 3 domains of ritual, when people have these transcendent experiences, and sort of worldview, attunement, finding a home within the cosmos. And these are sort of 3 dimensions of spirituality, very broadly construed. And so Gregg and I aren't going to review. I'll do a little bit more on ritual because that hasn't been part of our previous series, but it's part of some of my other videos. We're not going to review all because we went over a lot in a lot of videos, right? Well, our goal here is to try and do the following, to show that transcendent naturalism has a way of explaining these without explaining them away, giving it an explanation of them that shows why they afford strong transcendence in the way that we've been talking about it here, and therefore can ground a profoundly transformative, existentially relevant spirituality that is nevertheless completely conciliant with a science that has been situated within extended naturalism. And so that's how I see our project. Did you have anything you want to add to the overall framing, Gregg?
No, that's exactly right. And so I love the explaining, but not explaining away. I love we want a religio for the nuns in relation, and that's got to have a logical architecture that's conforming with science on the one hand. At the same time, it's got to be embedded in practices, in communities, in ways of being. It's got to connect to the wisdom of the wisdom traditions, right? At some level, what's happening to those kinds of things. So I think what we're doing now is sort of made the theoretical argument for sacredness in relation, and now like, well, what does that actually mean on the ground? And issues of ritual, issues of transcendent altered states, issues of worldview, and transcending identity. These are all real instances, and I know we'll focus mostly on ritual today, but I think what we're doing is we're really filling in sort of the practice side and then articulating that embodiment bridge between sort of science, spirituality in this emerging worldview we're gripping.
Excellent. Okay, so I'd like to start with ritual, and ritual, of course, has been something that has been put into question even before the scientific revolution. It's put into question by the Protestant Reformation, and then as it put under more pressure as that Reformation fragments. And then, of course, the scientific revolution comes in and seems to push us into a kind of propositional tyranny. And then ritual becomes it just seems like irrational belief formation within that framework. And then, of course, you have the increase of the secularization project under the Enlightenment. And then ritual, it gets slotted largely into superstition or things that so-called primitive people do because they don't have science. And of course, it's wrapped up into all the problems of imperialism and colonialism. And then you get a final knock in which Freud, sort of discovers the unconscious, at least the psychodynamic unconscious, and finds that it, seeks out ritual, but he can only understand that given that he's in that whole stream of development, as something deeply psychopathological. And so ritual behavior is an indication of neurosis, or perhaps even the onset of psychosis. And then, so you have this ever widening gulf between rationality, which is getting increasingly understood as computation, and ritual, which eventually seems to be neurotic or even psychotic behavior. And so and then anything that does anything other than that is, superstition. And of course, that's a somewhat nebulous category as well, although it's invoked frequently. So I think that, go ahead.
Can I just sort of okay, so for those of the scientists out there, well, maybe how it used to be or whatever, in a particular kind of way, why don't we at least note that we still have funerals, births, and marriage ceremonies?
Yes,
right?
we do.
Okay. Yeah. And why, what's happening there? So let's at least just point to these, the still vestiges of particular kind of community ritual structures. And man, to lose that, I'll just throw out there, that wouldn't it be dramatic to lose those, right? That they bind us in a particular kind of way, in an embodied way. So for the skeptic side of there that are following that, we still have, as though we lost a huge amount, we're still doing rituals of marriage, birth, and funeral. And that speaks to, I think, something to what we're going to articulate in terms of the nature of our natures, and why these kinds of practices may be absolutely central.
Yes, so that's well said. And when I gave the talk at Cambridge, I tried to make an argument about how ritual, there's a lot of implicit ritual in a lot of what we are doing without actually properly recognizing it. I'm just going to quickly review arguments. The arguments exist elsewhere, and we'll probably put extensive notes. I've been building what I think, and not I alone, other people, Yaden, and of course Shilbreck, and a whole bunch of other people, what you might call a philosophy psychology, a cognitive science of ritual. And I'd like to try and lay that out. But I'd like to start from the side of rationality first. And I'm going to, for each premise I introduce here, I'm going to ask the audience, the listeners, to trust that there's extensive arguments, and I can point them. But if I do the argument for every premise, this will get huge. So the first premise is there are important kinds of knowing associated with there's different kinds of knowing associated with different kinds of memory, associated with different kinds of normative standards, the 4 Ps of knowing. And so, and 4 ecog psi, and a lot of the work that I've done, and Gregg does work on it. We've been pointing to all the non-propositional knowing and how important that is to cognitive agencies. First of all, let's invoke that if we look at ritual only through the propositional lens, we're probably missing a lot of what it's doing, because the first premise is that ritual is, although there's propositional content in ritual, I just came back from an Eastern Orthodox monastery, right? Although there's propositional content, that's not there. It is totally in service of non-propositional kinds of knowing. And so that's the first. So if you come in and you're skeptical and all you've got is, this is just bad inference for bad belief formation, then I want you to step aside and think about, well, you have, in addition to your belief, you have your skills, and in addition to your skills, you have states of consciousness, perspective-taking states of consciousness, and in addition to those, you have traits of your character, your identity, yourself, and these are all different ways in which you know and understand the world. Okay, and so that's the first premise. The first premise is ritual should be more properly understood as addressing the non-propositional. It's more about developing skills, perspectives, and identities. So that's the first.
Lovely.
The second is we have to understand that there is a aspirational dimension to rationality. And this goes from the work of L.A. Paul and Agnes Callard, and then some experimental work by Hirschfeld and others. And this argument goes basically the following. whenever I go through a transformative experience, a genuine transformative experience, until I undergo the transformation, I don't have the perspectival and the participatory knowing. I only get it once I go through it. I don't know what it's going to be like to be a parent and how my character is going to change until I become a parent. And so you can't infer your way into it. I can read all kinds of books about being a parent, and everybody will tell you who's gone through this, they were helpful, but wow, so much more that I didn't, right? And you can't sort of reason your way into it. This goes, I don't know what that was. This goes with Jerry Fodor's argument that you can't compute your way from a weaker logic to a stronger logic. That argument's out there. So the point is you can't infer your way through a transformational experience. And then the question is, well, how do we do it? And my answer is we engage in what we see all intelligent creatures engage in. We engage in serious play. In serious play, we put ourselves into this liminal state where we're getting a sense of the perspectival and the participatory change, but we haven't completely committed to it. So before having a child, we might get a dog and see what that's like, right? And so it's serious play. So serious play. Next, aspiration. This is Agnes Callard. And aspiration, that serious play extends to a development in which you are trying to become something other than you are. You have a current self that is related to a future self that is considered normatively superior to the self that you currently are. But how could you possibly do that? Right? And of course, what she says is she doesn't really answer the how question. So I still think it's a kind of serious play. I'll come back to that. What she says is that notice that aspiration is a proper part of rationality. Because if to be more rational is to properly aspire. It is to become somebody that is more normatively valuable than who I am. And so if you say that the aspiration to rationality, which is a non-inferential serious play project, is not part of rationality, then you're in a performative contradiction. You can't ever recommend to somebody that they become more rational, because the process would have to engage in would be a non-rational or even irrational process. So what she's arguing for is there has to be a non-inferential notion of rationality that merges with L.A. Paul very, very beautifully. And then you also have the idea that rationality often requires a kind of self-control so that we can undertake the aspiration, so that we can prioritize long-term goals over current goals. This is about overcoming hyperbolic discounting, temporal discounting. And Hirschfeld does all this work showing, well, if you give people all the inferential and empirical evidence, they don't save for their retirement, for example. But if you go in and ask them to imagine their future self as somebody that they love, they've always loved, they've always taken care of, they've always felt responsible for, people will save, and they will save dependent on how often and how intensely they do the imagination. Now, this brings us to another. So first of all, rationality requires, aspiration. It requires, on one hand, serious play, and now the imagination. But here's the sense here. This is the imaginal, not the imaginary. The imaginary is when you picture things in your mind and you're cutting yourself off from reality. The imaginal is when you're using, the imagination, but in the sense of a child playing. What you're doing is you're trying to adopt the identity and the perspective of somebody, and so it's imagination that enhances your ability to perceive or conceive. It puts you into contact with reality. It makes you more aware of subtle patterns in your body and mind, etc. And again, this is more developed. So we have serious play and the imaginal are actually needed for rationality in a profound way. So just like you can have sort of virtually augmented perception, you can have imaginally augmented perception. And I won't repeat the arguments. Imagination is crucial in this way. The imaginal is central to deep learning. where
Yep.
fantasizing is part of what the system does in order to improve its ability to recognize the world, the generate to recognize function. It's deeply embedded in predictive processing. It's error up and basically imaginal down. And so all of this has converged on rationality requires an activation of non-propositional kinds of knowing, specifically those involved in serious play, in which people are relying on imaginally augmented perception and conception.
Okay. Good.
Now we can turn that around as yet, but can we evaluate that? Can we hold it to a rational standard? And so this goes to all the cognitive anthropology around ritual, around where ritual is basically seen, and the language is actually used as, you know, fitting you to the situation, right? It's deeply dripping in relevance realization, right? And then it has an anticipatory sense to it, which is precisely how you can evaluate its rationality. So it's an enhancement of relevance realization in which whatever you're doing, whatever you're training and cultivating in the situation, if it transfers outside of that situation broadly and deeply, then you can evaluate it for being more rational. If it right, if it keeps you trapped within the context of learning, then it's deeply irrational. And so you have a standard. So not only does rationality depend on ritual, you can see how ritual is rational. It's enhancing your relevance realization, and it does so in a way that transfers broadly and deeply. So transfer in that way is, of course, one of the ways in which we can go from individual insights or solving problems to discovering a system of problems and having a systemic insight, like we talked about in the transformation course, and thereby bringing about a significant form of self-transcendence and aspiration. And then it gets all tied together. You get why rationality needs ritual and how ritual can be rational, how it affords aspiration, how it affords transformative experience, and how it can do that in a comprehensive person identity changing manner. And then that is how ritual can fit into a transcendent naturalism. That's the argument in a gist.
All right. I mean, I think that what that does, from my vantage point, right, is that it orients us into, you know, I mean, a four-cognitive way, it orients us into embed and act, embody.
Yeah.
Right. And recognizing, and I'll pull a little bit of Jung here, often oriented is to archetypal patterns in relationship to the world.
Yes.
And to accelerate our capacity to shift perspectives around core archetypal patterns. And of course, that's going to get into multi-perspectival orienting in relation to value. That's going to place rationality in relation to wisdom, and it's going to bring some communal opportunities, not just in the individual, but it's going to then pull systems together for distributed cognition, distributed rationality in this regard.
Yes. So one of the things, and McNamara makes this, you know, religious experience, but rituals typically involve decentering, in which you're shifting off of often a first-person perspective and trying to take, you know, a God's eye perspective or the, you know, the future better self perspective. And that, of course, overcomes a lot of cognitive biases. It also triggers the Solomon effect, the thing that Igor Grossman found, that just shifting from first-person to third-person perspective can give you tremendous insight into your problems. And then, you're right, the thing about a ritual, in fact, Yaden proposes that we should use practice when it's individuals and rituals for when it's shareable, precisely because what it does is it puts people into, distributed cognition, gives them access to the collective intelligence, but also allows them to shape it and educate it to improve the fittedness of collective intelligence to a complex environment over time and space. So I think that's all right. And so notice what we've done here. We've said ritual is, we haven't explained it away. We've not said it's silly superstition. Now, there are things that can be, and we've said, well, this is how you can evaluate them. Here's a standard, a normative standard, a standard of rational evaluation, right? But ritual is not intrinsically superstitious. It's not intrinsically neurotic. It's not those are pathological versions of a process. that has a rational adaptive function to it, and that when it's properly understood can be normatively guided. But we're not telling anybody, like, that rituals don't belong. We're saying exactly the opposite. We're saying, no, you should be finding the rituals that best trigger the non-propositional knowing, get you into serious play, have you doing imaginal augmentation and perception, cognition and action, trigger distributed cognition, get you, right, get that going, right, fits you well to, and transfers broadly and deep, like, find rituals that do that and then practice them, right? And so not explaining it away, but explaining it in a way that actually encourages you to participate in them, but also gives you the tools by which you can rationally evaluate candidate rituals.
So I'm just coming back from the Metamodern Spirituality conference. The first night we were there, first official night of the conference, they set up 5 different stations associated with the core elements, earth, air, fire, water, and ether. And each one had a ritual leader. I happened to go with fire with Brendan. And we were in a fire hut. And he had set up, he had actually painted one of his all-seeing eye and was holding that as a mask, and invited us with no words, just music and gesture. We sat around the fire, and he had set out, we didn't plan that. I didn't know it was happening, but it was obvious just by what was intonated by what we're doing. And you had piece of paper, and he was taking actually paper from his Emerge book and burning them. Okay. And it gave them the key. And then I went up and I wrote out some core words that were associated with where I was in various identity places, and then wrote them out and kissed them, put them in the fire. And felt the process by which I was bringing in and releasing into the heat and light of fire in relationship to, okay, what is heat? What is light? Who am I? What is the world? All with no words, but it was a very, very meaningful. And then we got together, and then we all came together on the fire up on the top of the mountain and talked about why we chose, those of us, why you got off on one of the particular elements and what was the feel of that element in relation. So for those of you that are wondering, kind of like, hey, I mean, I would have 20 years ago, this was not the kind of thing that I was engaged in, but when you do it and you see it and you feel, it opened up a participatory perspectival structure in me, and I think in the group, in a way that was pretty fascinating. So that's just sort of an example of stuff to be explored in relationship to this kind of space.
Now that's great, because so you did something in which there's sort of an emerging ritual, right? But it's being very carefully crafted to have a lot of these dimensions that we've talked about, and it's apprehended and appreciated for its meaningfulness. I'm at an Eastern Orthodox monastery, and I'm participating in a tradition, right? Long stand, dressed and drenched in ritual, and just like, and for me, this was personally healing, because I had grown up in a version of Christianity that was very much propositional tyranny, very antithetical to ritual, to symbol, to even sort of accessing in a direct fashion the understanding of distributed cognition. And then I was in a form of Christianity that was exactly the opposite in so many ways. Of course, people were speaking, but the speaking was just in service of the the icons that in that, and the lighting is changing. They even will move the chandeliers and the lamps, so in your peripheral vision, right, there's and like the spirit is moving through, and you've got the icons, and they're alive in that candlelight, and then the incense, and there's rhythmic movement, and then there's singing and chanting, and people are moving and taking up different positions, and gesture, of course, is part of how we do imagine. Gesture is imaginal augmentation of perception and cognition. That's why you're doing it all day long, and all the research points to its efficacy. And I found it so well, like I said, healing for me, because it was able to, like, give me, of course, I have always had it intellectually. Well, there are other forms of Christianity. I'm not saying I'm
Right.
becoming a Christian. That's not what I'm saying here. But what I was saying is, at the non-propositional level, my whole embodied and embedded cognition got, oh, there are other kinds, right?
Right.
And so I found that profoundly healing for me in terms of
Lovely.
giving me, part of getting out of PTSD is can you reframe the reality, right?
Absolutely.
And that was very much what happened for me.
Right. To get that sort of proximal association and then shift the
Yes.
flavor of it, right? And then all of a sudden you open up a different kind of meaning structure in relationship to it.
Yeah, and a whole new possibility of relating to one's
Right.
own past in that case.
Lovely.
So I think what we've done is, and there's a lot more work going into this, and there's the Pickstock stuff on liturgy is also just opening this up profoundly. A lot of convergent argument and evidence for the intertwining of ritual and rationality and ritual, which I think is a very practicable way, experiential, transformative way.
John, do you want to, you've done this a lot, but for folks that, do you want to give just a quick summary of like intelligence, rationality, wisdom, or just place rationality in relationship to how that term is being used here?
Yes. So thank you. So intelligence, your general intelligence is your capacity to be a general problem solver, solve many kinds of problems in many kinds of domains. And of course, this is why the GPT people are talking about sparks of AGI, artificial general intelligence. It's a machine that is not just good at playing Go or doing this. It seems to be much more general. And there's controversy around that. I'm not going to get into that, but I'm just saying that's why that concept is invoked. So I've been making an argument with the help of a lot of other people, one of them being you, but of course, Tim Lilliclap, Ray Richards, Leo Ferraro, Brett Anderson, Mark Miller, right? That recursive relevance realization integrated with predictive processing, which I'd like to think of more as adaptive anticipation rather than just predictive processing, affords us an account of what that general intelligence is. There's lots of specific arguments. The core argument is general intelligence should solve some of the meta problems that are required to solve any particular problem. One meta problem is zeroing in on the relevant information, and the other one is how much can you anticipate that relevant information rather than just reacting to it. And those are two things you want to be doing across your problem solving. So while you're engaging in these processes, the very same processes that make you so adaptively fitted to your environment, and it's a conformity theory, make you perpetually prey to self-deception. You will ignore something as irrelevant that turns out to be relevant. You will not properly anticipate because you haven't captured the right factors all that sort of stuff, because you're always in a generalization discrimination problem when you're trying to predict and anticipate. And again, we've gone into a lot of these in more detail than other places. So the idea is, well, what rationality is you can learn, you can use your general intelligence to learn strategies, skills, shifts of mind that help you overcome the self-deception that arises from the use of your intelligence. So these can be attentional strategies like in mindfulness. They can be inferential strategies like active open-mindedness, etc. And so rationality is the suite of virtues, because if you integrate skills and states of mind and traits of character, right, you get virtues that allow you to overcome the self-deception and also allow you to enhance that fittedness to your environment. Nice. And that's how you can see, right, ritual fitting in the way it's enhancing, like, remember the relationship to your future self, anticipating your future self, transforming your future self, all that stuff. Now, of course, there's rationality for each. You not only want rationality within each of the kinds of knowing, you also want them to be ratio. This is Plato's idea. You want them to be in the best proportion relationship with each other. So you reduce as inner conflict as much as possible. You get as much cooperation. So you see more deeply into the world. And that allows the world to open up. Then you can learn from that to better see into yourself. And then that depth inward allows you to even more properly align and proportion. So you see, and then you get this reciprocal opening. And so wisdom is that sort of rationally self-transcending rationality that is aspiring to a ratio religio, a properly proportioned connectedness that is constantly orienting us. This is what Sophrosyn is, towards a reciprocal opening. That would be
Great.
so wisdom ameliorates self-deceptive, self-destruction, foolishness. It enhances flourishing by enhancing ratio religio. And then that plugs into all the stuff you and I have done about enhancing well-being, flourishing, etc.
Lovely.
Is that
Lovely.
enough?
I just said, oh, plenty. But at the level of just, yeah, that's a wonderful, since we're using that as to bridge into ritual, that to make sure that's front and center in folks' mind. I thought that's a wonderful summary.
Yeah, I think yeah, ritual is one of the bridges between rationality and wisdom, given that it's pushing on the transformational, aspirational, identity changing dimension of rationality, and then and the cultivation of virtue, and then we're starting to shade into wisdom. And
Lovely.
I think there's a continuum. So turn intelligence on itself, you get rationality. Turn rationality on itself, you get wisdom.
Absolutely.
And then there's the possibility, to now segue into the next thing, that we can enhance intelligence along this line and get something like more wisdom, but we can also transform consciousness along another continuum, the insight, flow, mystical experience, higher states of consciousness continuum, and we get something like gnosis. I'm not a Gnostic, and people who keep accusing me of that, stop doing that, right? How could somebody who advocates so strongly for embodiment and embedment, like, be a Gnostic? That doesn't make any sense, right? So anyways, you have wisdom sort of on the intelligence side, and then you have gnosis on the consciousness side, but consciousness and intelligence are intertwining. And when gnosis and wisdom mutually afford each other, so individuals can see through messy, complex situations and can reliably and systematically address perennial problems of self-deception, of anguish, of absurdity, of anxiety, of alienation, of despair, and can enhance people's sense of connecting to what's more real. That's my proposal of what enlightenment is. That and so that takes us into the next stage is, well, what role do higher states of consciousness have in there? Well, we made an argument, Gregg and I, that, and we're not going to repeat that argument about both consciousness, and we did another one with Chris, Master Pietro, about the self. And what the basic argument is, consciousness, its function is this higher order recursive relevance realization. And now I would add in the adaptive anticipation. And when you get these kinds of transformations in consciousness, like you have an insight and flow, you get an enhancement of religio connectedness, you get a diminishment of self-centeredness, you get all of this stuff. And so higher states of consciousness, I argue, and Gregg and I talked about this, and there was convergence, is when you're taking consciousness's function of giving us a meta-optimal grip, an orienting stance on the world, and that's where you're flowing. That's where it's not the flow state of how to play hockey or how to play tennis, but it's the flow state of how to orient, meta-optimally grip, and take an appropriate stance for navigating the complexities of the world. That's a higher state of consciousness. That's gnosis. You integrate it in. So not explaining it away, but in fact explaining how enlightenment is possible, how those higher states of consciousness can have a function, how that function can be integrated with the educating of intelligence through rationality into wisdom, and then that can all be integrated together into an account of enlightenment that is reverse engineered to solve the perennial problems that confront human beings. And I take it that explains again without explaining away.
Lovely. I'll just summarize that from sort of my UTOK vantage point. So let's divide human consciousness up into 4 different dimensions. We got a pure awareness state, open your eyes. Okay. That's a sort of a beam of recursive relevance realization, active
Yeah.
inference at its base. Okay. And you have an adverbial frame. Okay. That is then pulling adjectival sensory perceptual stuff. So you open your eyes, you see your apple. The standard mode of every day is that comes into your primate self. And we talked about sort of a carried self, an animal, mammal self, and then a primate self that's say particularly relevant for things like how do you feel in belonging? What's your
Yes.
status? So you see this, hey, does this person like me? They don't like me. What are the power, love, and freedoms? That's the normal, intuitive, self-other matrix response. Your ego is just justifying, hey, is this, try to maintain a justified state of being. You're tracking your persona and your identity, and that's how you're getting through the world. Okay. So you have a being, an organizing structure of adverbial, adjectival consciousness, and then gripping structures, the core of the primate self, the private person ego, and that's how we go through the world.
Yeah.
Right?
Excellent.
And then what we can do in transcendent states, ultimately, things happen where the normal self-world grip of that everyday experience of who am I and what's relevant to me and how is this can be broken, can be melted, can be transformed. And the transcendent ultimate experiences is when that standard self, it goes through an evolution, a transformation. There's some kind of shift and an accommodation, to use Piagetian terms, and a transformation in the new self-world grip. And the transcendent experiences are when that light cone of possibility, where the self-world grip both and then reestablishes itself in a new relation.
Yes.
And then affords this capacity for a broadening, a minor ego death or whatever, sort of like, okay, hey, and a transpersonal perspective, a transcendent perspective along those lines. And then, of course, you laid out sort of a continuum of process when we get insight flow, etc. But basically, the enormous amount of convergence there, and about why we should be sort of cultivating that. And if you bring your rational perspective, angling, well, what is rationality? Well, it's breaking some of the parasitic grips that are creep us vulnerable to self-deception and to maintain a particular narrowing of the worldview. Well, that's completely concordant with why then transcendent states would be part of this whole equation.
So I think that's amazing. It sounded better, I think, when you said it than I did, but okay.
I mean, I think we're saying the same thing.
We are. Now, I
Um,
think we brushed on it last time, but I wanted to bring back, this sort of more recent thesis I've been playing with and seriously playing with, the idea that recursive relevance realization, adaptive anticipatory, right, processing, that relevance realization machinery can come to a place where it realizes its own irrelevance. Because it's always interested in itself, because it's always self-corrected. And it can fall into a state where it's irrelevant, and then because you're not trying to deal with beings and the combinatorially explosive relationships with beings, you're trying to deal with the utter simplicity, unity of the ground of being. It's right. And that experience, and you can hear all the Heideggerian, but also the Telikian and other thinkers saying, there's a state, and then of course there's similarities, of course, in Buddhism and Taoism, not identities, similarities, where you get to this place where there is this profound letting go, so that one can come into a ratio religio with being, or the ground of being itself, or the one, if you wanted to be Neoplatonic, which I would be. And so I think that, which is, kind of an ultimate transcendent experience, mystical, higher state of consciousness, can still be readily integrated into the framework we've been talking about here. We're not violating the framework. We're not explaining it away. We're actually saying, this is how and why it can bring you into relationship with what is ultimately most real. Allow you to exercise ultimate concern for what is ultimately real, as Tillich would say, and therefore, again, explaining it, but not explaining it away, but nevertheless, not having to invoke anything that stands outside of extended naturalism.
Totally. Lovely.
So the last thing, and I was also just in Chino at the conference for the Quest for a Spiritual Home. I gave my talk there. My talk is already on Paul Vanderklee's channel. I suppose by the time this video comes out, the talk will be out on my channel soon too. And I did a lot I made use of John Allen's work on the evolution of home, and Kellyanne Allen, both Allens, work on the psychology of belonging to argue for sort of what, like the cognitive science of home, what's the dimensional structure, the phenomenology, the functionality. And I talked about sort of 3 stages that John Allen talks about. It talks about first how we're moving towards a notion of niche construction in evolution. The animal isn't just being pressured by the environment. The animal shapes the environment, and the environment shapes the animal. And then the culture, of course, is distributed cognition, just putting that whole process on speed, right? Just right. And so you get what's known as the home range. And I argued that this is the sort of grounding of the sense of belonging that Kellyanne Allen talks about, that the function that produces the sense of belonging, and the function is the fitting in function, is our capacity for niche construction. A quick side note, I talked about your work because to me, the belonging literature is, as far as I see, exactly identical with the mattering dimension of the meaning in life literature, but these two parts of psychology are not talking to each other, not comparing their research. So Gregg Henriques comes in and says, the fragmentation of psychology, and I reference that. Yeah, definitely the case. Jingle jangle all the way. But you can see why belonging would matter. And then we moved into the idea of the home base. That what starts to evolve is a shared space, and you can use a little bit of prospect and refuge, where refuge isn't so much hiding, but a defensible or a place you can escape from if needed, right? Lovely. And so you can bring stuff there, and you can right, you can go out, you can distribute, and then you can gather back together and do distributed cognition on processing food and butchering and protecting the food stores and all that. So you've got this sort of relevance realization machinery working, and you've got an origin place for it. And then, so I talked about that in Stegmeyer's work on orientation. This is a way of giving you a origin to horizon relationship that, right? And as soon as you do that, instead of just having niche construction in which you wander between, what you do is you now have a map that allows you to interpolate and extrapolate your exploration instead of just happenstance, habit, and repetition. So you get the power of orientation coming in. And then once you have that, it becomes relatively easy to get the hearth. And then the hearth then becomes also the hospital. And in the hearth, you have a place. Remember, you invoked fire. You have a place that can be the center for ritual transformation, serious play, all of Matt Rossano's work. You have the hospital, in which we're doing shamanic stuff to heal people, and you've got that at the home, right? And so you get all this ritual core. So you've got the hearth hospital situating within the home base, which situates within the home range, and you get all of these functions and why they're all condensed together. And then that's home. And then I said, what we're looking for is...
Actually, can I just jump in there?
Yeah, please, please.
All right. So yeah, let's just put this, let's think of ourselves as a stacked phylogenetic, ontogenetic, organism, animal, mammal, primate, person, right? So animals, all right, we're going to build a little niche. We're going to, carve out a little cave. We're going to build our little beaver dam. We're going to create the ecological feedback loop so that our approach avoidance structure of safety and behavioral investment, what's conserved and predictability, what's the range that we're going to explore. So you get sort of that openness into the range, back into the conservation, right? And there's a space-time, things have affordances, things have dangers, and then we become social, right? And then we take the influence matrix with, our attachment systems, our placement in the hierarchy and placement in connection to each other in relation. We actually do co-opt the space-time structures. Then we place ourselves nested into the belongingness of the relation, where it's relational value and connection. Am I loved? So are you homed by the physical environment? And then are you homed by the relational environment? And then we can be pointing to this, well, we're going to get homed by our propositional justificatory environment, our shared narrative of where we
Yeah,
fit inside of the universe.
yeah.
And we can then see sort of that stacked, and what matters to us is to be homed and then to explore and to
Yes.
carry across that dialectic in a healthy way.
Excellent. Excellent. Again, really good. And so, and then you already said, we reuse it, we exapt it, we co-opt it. And so the quest for a spiritual home, as I was saying, okay, what people are looking for is they're looking for these homing functions, but they're not looking for it on, within the physical environment. They're looking for it within the cultural, and ontological environments. They want to be able to level up. They want to be able to do everything we're talking about. So they want a place that gives them the belonging, but also orients them, and that also, affords them to go through ritual transformation. And none of this is in any way inconsistent with transcendent naturalism. In fact, it's it's something that's entailed by transcendent naturalism in a thoroughgoing manner. And so the things that
in some ways it feels almost like the point, right? I mean,
yes,
what we are missing fundamentally is God is dead, right?
Yeah.
And we're in this place of the meaning crisis, and we're looking around, and there's no homing worldview that creates alignment across the wisdom stack.
That's right.
And that's one way to describe what is that worldview that affords clarity about our participatory perspectival stack historically and currently within the world.
And I think we addressed that last time when we talked about fundamental orientation and homing in the sense of the sacred that can be afforded within. So within transcendent naturalism, so we can fit ritual in a deep sense into this. We can fit the whole continuum of the sapiential and the mystical into this, and then we can fit the homing into it. And it's like it's not clear what remains, right? Like sorry, I want to be clear. Obviously there, and I mean, I'm in good faith relationship with people who think there is more, and I all I can say is I believe that you're authentically believing that, but that's not something I can come this far, and they'll often say you've come so far, and I appreciate that. That's really valuable. But so I'm not going to try and decide that issue, but what we can say is how you frame this from the beginning. If you're a nun, N-O-N-E-S, this can work for you profoundly. If you're in a legacy religion, we have lots of feedback that this helps people go back into it or deepen their appreciation and apprehension of it, affords them to aspire more profoundly within it. So transcendent naturalism really is, in James's term, a very, very viable option right now.
Amen. Amen. I mean, especially when we talk about what we did with all the classic, you make the difference between common theism, classic theism, right?
Yes.
And then you look at the embodied traditions. And as we've talked about, I think we're both in agreement that this is a pretty kairotic moment in the world.
Yes.
Right. And so in relationship to the sacred, if we think about this in terms of, well, what are the extended gripping functions that are going to afford contact with the real, oriented toward the one? It to me, it calls for a very experiential, existential, meaningful, spiritual orientation, and yes, all embedded in the, like, collectively, like, it's like, yes, wow, this is really important. We got to wake up to the meaning crisis. We got to wake up to ChatGPT and the digital metacultural joint point. So it even, to me, it both homes and houses and also orients us, and then places us in a kairotic moment that calls forth particular elements. And to me, they're like, man, that's a lot at the level of spirituality, of core mattering, of these kinds of issues. It seems to hold that very, very nicely as far as I'm concerned.
Excellent. I think that last point was a really excellent amendment. Yes, that it also resonates kairotically very well. I think, thank you for that. That's a very good point. That's excellent. So I think that you and I have, with these four, built
I think
a good exposition, elucidation of transcendent naturalism, and we should now enter into discussion with our chosen and cherished interlocutors about this proposal.
absolutely. I think we have done a good job laying the groundwork, and I think bringing more voices, more perspectives will enrich it in a particular, in many different ways.
Thank you very much, my good friend.
Hey, man, thank you. Deeply appreciate it.